Hello, hello. Tammy Goen here, highly sensitive or high sensitivity coach. Welcome to my station, my channel, Surviving to Thriving for Highly Sensitive People, where I will go deep into all things high sensitivity so that my main goal is that you will go from merely managing, just surviving, to truly thriving, embracing the traits and allowing life to be all that it can be. So today I really wanted to kind of get a really deep overview, if we can, and in terms of what high sensitivity is all about. And sometimes, in some cases, that also includes things that it's not. So I am going to share my screen here. All right. So we have reverted to the end. There we go. All right. So high sensitivity, which is really called sensory processing sensitivity, which is kind of a mouthful. So we just opt for high sensitivity. I also like to think of it as highly sensing. In our culture these days, sensitivity has kind of a bad vibe sometimes. So highly sensing is a really good term that I kind of prefer. And it's really about what the trait is highly sensing things. So what we want to talk about first is what it is not. Because in this culture, at least, it's often assumed, like when I say to somebody, oh, I'm highly sensitive, or I work with highly sensitive people, often I will hear things like, oh, yeah, I know some sensitive people too. And there's a sense of kind of like, well, they just need to kind of fix themselves and then, then come back and see me kind of thing. And it's really there's a lot of myths out there, a lot of misunderstandings. So I really like to kind of clear things up so that you first are aware of what high sensitivity is not, that is quite often assumed. And one of those things is that it's some kind of diagnosis or something that needs to be treated and made go away. So like a diagnosis, it's a disease, it's a disorder, it's something not okay that needs to be taken care of and removed. And that is definitely not the case. And it's also not a choice. It's not something that we just say, oh, I kind of want to be a little more difficult or challenging for people, so I'm going to choose to be highly sensitive. And that obviously doesn't happen. And as I mentioned, we don't need to be fixed. We don't need to solve this problem and then everything will be okay. It's just a matter of learning how to work with it and sharing with other people, which is what this station or this show is all about. And another thing, especially for men in our culture, but for everyone, for the most part, we do get this sense of, if you're highly sensitive, it must mean that you're weak or you're too feminine, you're a sissy, that kind of thing. And it's not that at all. It's really about that deep processing. And we'll get to that in a moment. And then the other thing that tends to come up a lot, there's an assumption that because of some of the ways that we respond or react to things, that we are somehow highly sensitives, are antisocial. And that is definitely far from the truth, as we will see here soon. So those are just some things to be aware of. If you come across some assumptions in the community, you can talk to these points that these are not the case. So what is high sensitivity? Again, sensory processing sensitivity, it's not the same as sensory processing disorder. So it's not a disorder, but it is all about processing. And it's a genetic trait. It's what we're born with it. So they even discovered that they can tell that a lot of babies, in utero show signs of being highly sensitive. So you can see from the very, very beginning. So people will say, oh, well, did I develop this as I went along? Most likely, if you are highly sensitive and you resonate with all of the factors involved in that, then you were just born that way. So it's nothing, again, nothing to change. It's just who you are. And it's actually 15 to 20%, maybe even a little bit more than that. The recent research is showing a little bit more, a little higher than maybe that, even 20% of the population. And it's so within that subset, if you think of yourself as one of the 20% or so, then most of the stuff that you experience is probably pretty normal. Maybe it doesn't gel with the 80% that's not highly sensitive, but that's just within those normal bounds. And then we have the male-female split, which is pretty well 50%, 50-50. And that tends to surprise people quite often because in the society, it's very, very expected that men will be, they'll man up, they'll be brave and strong, and they'll be not sensitive. There's this assumption that men are not supposed to be sensitive. So a lot of times men who are highly sensitive don't necessarily present to other people as being that, or even acknowledge that within themselves, because they're told for so long that they shouldn't be highly sensitive or shouldn't be sensitive at all. But it is about 50% of the population, and it's both introverts and extroverts. So not all highly sensitive people are introverts. About 70% are, but there are plenty of extroverted, highly sensing people. And there is even a subset called high sensation seeking highly sensitives, who are really putting themselves out there and really going for these amazing experiences. And it's all within that umbrella of high sensitivity. So really, it's all about processing. So it's sensory processing sensitivity. It's everything that's coming in from the world and from your own experience and your own emotions. You're processing that at a much deeper level than someone who's not highly sensitive. And so there's nothing wrong with that. I like to talk about it as being, if you compare it to being left-handed or right-handed. People who are left-handed, back in the day, people tried to force them into becoming right-handed, but we don't do that anymore. And usually we accommodate people that have special needs, as it's seen quite often, which is really not the case. To just need different pair of scissors, or sitting on the end, the other end of the table, so they're not bumping into people on that dominant side. We don't really think about that kind of stuff anymore. It's like, oh, sure, we'll take care of that. So it's pretty much the same thing. It's just the way we're wired. So if they take nothing away from today other than this, I'm going to say that again. Imagine that you're sharing that with somebody else and you're trying to explain what that's all about. And you can just say, you know what, it's just the way I'm wired. It's the way I perceive things, the way I process things. So we can get a better idea if we look at this acronym, which is one of Elaine Aron's creations. She's the one that did all of the initial research. And we can use this little acronym to kind of remember if we want to share it with somebody else, but to really understand it. So D is that depth of processing, which I have mentioned. And everything is really, really important. We give a lot of meaning to pretty much everything in life. So a lot of times people are thinking like, oh, it's no big deal. Why are you holding on to that? Well, because we process it really deeply, and it's really, really important. So that's one of the main characteristics, is just everything is really important and processed deeply. So sometimes that takes us longer to process things because we see things from all sides and we pull all this information in, we need to process it. And that can take a little bit longer. And then the O stands for the overstimulation or the overwhelm, sensory overload. The stuff that's coming in constantly from the environment, from culture, from the energy, just everything around us. It's like we're giant sponges without the same filters that some people might have. So that stuff is just constantly coming in. And so it's easy to get overwhelmed. We can go 110% and not be able to backtrack. We can think we can do something and then we just don't have the bandwidth for it. We can get really overwhelmed. And quite often, if you think about the nervous system and how that works, if you are stressed, you have too much on your plate, then you can become overwhelmed, but you can feel, you'll slip into that like fight or flight response. And that happens much more easily for highly sensitive people because we're just bringing all of that information in and processing it so deeply. And then the E is for emotionality. We feel emotions really intensely. This does not necessarily mean you can look at someone who's highly sensitive and say, oh, that person's super emotional, because that can happen. We can be like outward with those emotions and that can make some people uncomfortable, but we can also get tired of hearing, oh, we shouldn't be this way. And these emotions are too intense. And so we can start to stuff them or just not allow them or acknowledge them. And so even though we're experiencing them on a level that's super deep, we might not be expressing them. And that's something that I always work with my clients on, because it's easy to get in that mode of not feeling, which is something that I'm working on in my own journey, just because they can be really, really intense. And then we have the sensing the subtle, which is actually one of my favorite things about being highly sensitive, is that we just really tend to notice the details in everything, stuff that people just let go, they don't notice. And for us, they're really, really obvious. You know, how can anybody not know these things or not see these things? And oftentimes I hear people saying this, like, how did you even, you know, how is that even on your radar? And I said, well, I don't know, it's pretty obvious to me because it's just right there. Because it's just, I pick up on all those little things, and I enjoy that because it can be really amazing and add a lot of things to my life because of all of those little details. And of course, they can become overwhelming if you're not taking care of yourself and you're just like bombarded by all of these little things. But if you have all those tools, then it can be really, really quite amazing. So let's talk about a little bit of the challenges, which, you know, of course, I've referred to as we've gone along here a little bit. We have the feeling alone and misunderstood, or that we're ridiculous, we're wrong, there's something terribly wrong with us. Sometimes people even feel like they're crazy. They feel like they just don't belong in society or even on this planet. I hear that quite a lot. It's like, I just feel like I'm from a different planet and I do not belong here. It's just such a common thing with all of the people that I see. And then we're often told, so we tend to develop this understanding or belief from the time we were very, very little, that our behavior or the way we perceive things or interact with life is just completely unreasonable. It's not okay. It's too this, too that, or not enough this. It's us being demanding or dramatic, that we're ridiculous, that there's just no reason for what we're experiencing. We just need to fix that and make it different, make it not like that so that we're like everybody else. And another challenge is that overwhelm that I talked about on the DOES acronym. That overwhelm can be really, we can experience that a lot sooner and at a lot more intense level than non-highly sensitives, just because, again, we're processing all of that information. But if you think about it as having like two buckets, and one bucket is all of the input that comes in from the external world, and then we have our own energy reserves bucket, and we really want those to be, you know, pretty well balanced so that we can manage everything that's coming in. But if we are overflowing the input bucket, then having enough energy to manage everything can be a real challenge. And then we end up in that overwhelm. Sometimes people want to just crawl into a hole or into their bed and, you know, cover up with a blanket and make the world go away and just not having to deal with it. They can get, you know, we can get really, really tired and just exhausted and worn out by life, and it can be really confusing because we can look around to other people and say, well, they seem to be able to handle it okay. What's my problem? And it's just, again, about all of that, that balance of that energy and the input and knowing what to do with that. And then we are like the canaries in the coal mine. We can notice things before everybody else, and that can be a really positive thing, a real benefit. And then at other times it can be a real challenge because we can't weed that stuff out. It's like my example, if you tuned in last week, about like going to a restaurant and having all of these different, the music, the people talking, the pool balls, the, you know, people running back and forth with food and drinks, and all of the phone ringing and all of these things happening. It's really hard to fine tune and pay attention to something when all of that's there, because we pick up on all of those little things. But that also allows us to notice if things are not good for us or other people and act on that. But it can be definitely a challenge when you're just picking up on all of those things. But we will be the ones that notice things that other people miss. And again, sometimes that will be a positive thing, but it can definitely be a challenge. So how do we know if someone is highly sensitive, which I talked a little bit about last week, but often the people that come to me, or the people will say, well, you know, if I'm talking to someone, how do I know? They tend to be overwhelmed a lot of the time, not just like once in a while when certain things happen, but like a lot of the time. Lot of overwhelm, lot of stress and anxiety that tends to lead to a pretty significant level of anxiety with a lot of highly sensitives, especially if they don't have a lot of tools to mitigate that. And then sometimes we can be very distracted. We can be laser focused on something, but we can also be very distracted by our environment. And that can be like noises and activity going on. It can be lights. It can be just anything that disturbs that area can be very distracting for us. So even though we can be focused on our task, and we're usually good with that, we can be really distracted. So people who are distracted quite easily really have a hard time dealing with their environment, constantly talking about how much everything affects them and how much they don't like that. We tend to be frustrated by coworkers and what their behaviors are, or can be frustrating to people in the workplace because of these, some things just don't really work well for us. And then sometimes we can get pretty, because of that overwhelm, pretty like inward and avoid socializing. So sometimes people, again, think it might be antisocial, or it's like, why does that person not want to get together, and always cancels. And so those are some of the commonalities. And then we tend to be those that people just kind of know that they can go to when they have an issue or they want to be understood. And so that's a common thread with highly sensitive. It's like, oh yeah, I can just be standing at the cash register and someone will turn around and start telling me their life story. And you're wondering what did I say that brought this on? But it's just kind of because of our energy and our focus, that tends to happen. And then we are very detail oriented. And sometimes we have to have things just right. Some people are very neat and organized, and not necessarily all highly sensitives, but we tend to like things in a certain way, or we really pay attention to all of those little details. So like at work, that tends to be more apparent, where someone is just like focused on so many little details and everyone else is like, it's no big deal, just don't worry about all of that. So let's talk about the nervous system. I talked about fight or flight, and we have the fight or flight, rest or digest, the sympathetic parasympathetic system. And our nervous system, I mean, this is the first thing I always address when I work with clients, because if we don't have our nervous system at a manageable level, we are not going to be doing well with all of that potential overwhelm. We really need to have a solid, low baseline for our nervous system, so that all that stuff that is coming in, we can do something about, and it doesn't get to that point of overwhelm so quickly. And then we can just shift as often as possible into that rest and digest, and just processing everything at a nice flow, instead of being wrapped up in that fight or flight. And we do have that lower threshold, if you will, for anxiety, for depression, for various types of stress. We can just feel that sooner. It can be more intense if we don't have all those right tools. And I mentioned before that's like having these different filters that are not nearly, it seems like they're not nearly as effective as non-highly sensitives, that we just have all this stuff coming in, but it's just not getting filtered the way that would be a little bit more helpful, actually. And then there's that distractibility. If we have our nervous system nailed down and it's calm and we can manage things, then we're not as distractible, and we don't hit that sense of depletion so quickly. So let's talk about relationships, because that can be really tricky sometimes. And it includes friendships and the work setting and social relationships, anyone in the family, parents and children. One of the things that I do is consult with parents who have highly sensitive children, so they get an idea of how to support them. But if you're a highly sensitive parent, there's a whole nother realm of things to consider if you're working with either a highly sensitive child or a non-highly sensitive child, and all of the things that can trigger you as that parent in that environment, with all of those specifics. If you're with a highly sensitive child, you can understand and support pretty well, but you can still be triggered by certain things. And then if you have a non-highly sensitive child, all kinds of different things can become triggers for you. So we have workplace situations, romantic partnerships. I mean, all of these things are going to be affected if you're in a place that you're not okay with being highly sensitive, or if you don't know how to share and get your needs met. They can definitely affect your relationships. So being able to address different viewpoints, and realizing that, oh, I see life this way, they see life that way. Neither one of it is necessarily right, wrong, but they don't really mesh. So how can we make that more doable? Okay, so I talked about lots of challenges and lots of things, and you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with all this, but we do have benefits. Yay, it's an exciting thing. It really is a gift. And that's one of my goals, is to try to help everyone recognize and embrace that it's like, oh, this is a gift. It has its challenges, but it's a really good thing. So since we have this canaries in the coal mine idea, all of those ability to notice all those little details, to feel energy in certain situations, walk into a room and go, oh, something's off. I need to take care of something to fix this. And we're really good at that. And that can be helpful in the workplace. That can be helpful in the family in particular. And so it can bother us in some ways, but it can really be a benefit. And then we tend to be quite compassionate and empathetic, and we're pretty conscientious. We're usually pretty good at getting our projects done, and doing what we say we're going to do if we can. And it's just kind of a natural flow for us. We do tend to think outside the box. We look at all sides of things when we're getting ready to process deeply. We have all kinds of information that we're going to process. So we usually end up with some pretty good decision-making ability. And then we tend to be very creative and imaginative, and we're moved really a lot by usually beauty and nature. We usually have a really strong connection with nature. And that's one of the go-tos for us for maintaining that nervous system stability, is spending a lot of time in nature as much as possible. And then another benefit is that attention to detail, which we can get bogged down in, but if we have the right tools and the right focus, that can really be beneficial to ourselves, and then in the workplace and in the family, all of those different realms. So let's talk about self-care. Again, calming the nervous system, really, really important. We can do all kinds of different techniques for that. The other thing is that it's really, really important to have a lot of downtime. And Elaine Aron and others will suggest, and this might kind of blow your mind a little bit for a moment, but if you can do 2 hours a day and an entire day on the weekend of just solo downtime to decompress, you're going to be, functioning optimally as a highly sensitive. Now, I know I say that to people and they're like, are you kidding, right? How could I possibly ever fit that in my schedule? But if you think of that as a goal, it kind of helps you understand that, oh, wow, it really is important for me to have that. It's important for me to take care of myself, to have all that downtime, to take care of my nervous system, and then also to sleep. It's really, really helpful for us to get a lot of sleep. I mean, at least your 8 hours, more if you need, but really consistent, good quality sleep so that we can manage everything else. And again, time in nature, but also time creating, just even if it's something that no one else sees, something, if you're writing or making music, or just, visual arts, painting, drawing, whatever it is, doing crafts, something that uses those creative juices is really helpful, just in terms of taking care of yourself and honoring yourself. And then boundaries, which is of course a whole nother topic, we will get to eventually, but having boundaries, learning how to say no is huge for highly sensitives, because we're always concerned about what other people are thinking and, what do I do with that? But it's just a good focus to have. So let's talk about, how do you support highly sensitive? So whether you're in the workplace, or you have a friend who's highly sensitive, or you just want to know how to ask for support from someone else who's not highly sensitive. So again, it's really important to validate that everyone has different focus. We all have different needs. There's none that are wrong. Just like with the left-handed person has, different needs than a right-handed person if you're doing a craft or if you're eating or whatever. It's not a bad thing. It's not wrong, that we just have different needs. And so we can ask for support from other people. But if others are wanting to know, how do you support a highly sensitive person? One thing that's really good to do is ask for feedback and ask, how is this for you? Does this work? Is there something that would work better for you? Or just like, can you clue me in? I don't know what this is like for you. Can you share that with me? And be open to what that will look like, because it'll be different than what you're used to. And then you can, if you're in the workplace, allowing for schedule flexibility, for a lot of break time, so that nervous system can be managed, minimize noise and chaos, or like tons of expectations, or one of the things that I always talk about, like if you are coming home from work, the last thing that's going to be helpful for highly sensitive is to have constant bombardment from, kids asking questions and, oh, what do you want for dinner? And all that kind of stuff, having a nice little time to ease into that so that you're not just, constantly going and then being bombarded by all of these things. And allowing for personal space, whether that's in the home, if it's your child, or if you're in the workplace. And then validate and encourage them to make their needs known, but don't treat them as somebody different. Just acknowledge that there are differences, but they're not like special needs. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. I've used up the majority of our time, and I just want to have that brief overview. And if you have any questions, please do reach out, and I will certainly answer any questions that you might have. And if you do go to my website, if you scroll toward the bottom of my main page, you will see a link to sign up for a couple free ebooks that will give a little bit more information if you want to share that with somebody else. Thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I will see you next week.